madness that goes on in my brain from time to time. So today in particular, I'm going to let you dive into the madness that happens in between my ears on a weekly basis. Usually I polish it a bit more than I have this week, for the intention that you guys get to wrestle with the verses that I've wrestled with this week, in the hopes that we can come to kind of a collective understanding and hopefully a better walk with Christ. Our study on Tuesdays, not our study on Tuesdays, the study that I have on Tuesdays, is going through the book of James. And so this week I dived into the book of James, and I ran across chapter 5 and verse 5. And I've read this probably 100 times, and most of the times I have just soothed myself to say that, well, obviously this is not me. I've never owned a farm, I've never hired laborers, therefore this verse doesn't really apply to me at all. This week, however, due to a lot of other conversations I've had, some of the wording hit me in a way that has hit me before. Like, ooh, I probably should really consider whether or not this verse applies to me. And so as I dove into verse 5 a bit further, the spiral continued. So you guys get to hear a little bit of the 5 or 6 hour struggle that I had to come up with some answers in the hopes that we can come up with some answers together. Let's start back in chapter 5 and verse 1. James writes, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasures in the last day. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your field, which you have kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on this earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous persons. He does not resist you." And so the whole tone of verses 1 through 6 are heavily judgmental verses. They are not pulling punches. He doesn't beat around any bushes. There are no bushes to beat around. He just tells you how it is. And as you read through it, you think, oh, well, this can't be me. I know rich people, and I'm not a rich person. I'm just, middling of this world. He then talks about laying up treasures. You want to see my bank account, you know that just isn't happening. So then he mentions that I have fattened my heart in the day of slaughter. You think, well, okay, maybe I have fattened my heart a little bit, maybe a few too many burgers. But then verse 6 again, you think, well, I have not condemned and murdered any righteous person. So therefore, these verses are not dealing with me. I don't check enough of the boxes to really be concerned with these verses. I'm not overly rich. I haven't fattened my heart too awful much. My liver, however, different story. And I haven't murdered anybody. I don't have a field that I hire to have people come out and mow. And I had never held back their wages by defrauding them. But in verse 5, he says, you have lived on this earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. If you're reading the King James, I believe it's, you have been wanton. If you're reading the New King James, it's, you have lived in pleasure. The New American Standard, if you happen to be reading that, is wanton pleasure, kind of mixing the two of King James, New King James. And the Holman Christian Standard is indulged yourself. So I didn't go through all the translations. I left it with 5 just to kind of quiet some of the noise in my brain. But those terminology for the New American Standard, King James, New King James are terms that we don't really use in English. I've never heard anybody accuse another person of living wantonly. It's never something I've heard another person do. So I thought, well, let's look it up in English, because that's my only language. That's a good language to work with, my only language. And it's really just living in pleasure, living kind of self-indulgently, which is how the English Standard renders it, which is self-indulgence. So I thought, well, maybe I should look this up in Greek, because I don't know Greek. A little Greek is a dangerous thing, so find a little Greek and then go and do dangerous things. So I looked up a little Greek, and the only other place that this word comes in is in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and in verse 6. These 3 passages are coming to play eventually. And so I thought, here in 1 Timothy chapter 5, or James chapter 5, this is something that I need to really consider. Because while maybe in my current society I am not considered rich, by the rest of the world, we are all considered rather rich. If about 50% of the world's population lives on about $1 a day, we're probably doing pretty good. If I don't only have clothes, but I have a lot of clothes. And I don't just have a lot of clothes, I have a lot of reasonably nice clothes. And this may apply to me, of living in luxury and in self-indulgence. And we don't just have houses or apartments, we have pretty large houses and apartments. And they're not just pretty large houses and apartments, they're pretty nice houses and apartments. Electricity and running water and air conditioning and heat and carpet and all the things that work. And this may be us living in luxury and in self-indulgence. And we don't just have transportation, we have our own personal cars. And they're not just cars, they're nice cars, even if it is a Dodge diesel. Sorry to be. And they're not just nice cars, but they have air conditioning, they have heaters, they run well. We don't just have one, we probably have a couple of them. Maybe this is us living in self-indulgence. And while maybe I haven't done all the things in chapter 5, maybe there's some things that I really need to consider. Have I lived a life in luxury and in self-indulgence, or lived in pleasure, or been found wanting? That's a challenge. As Americans, that is our culture, to live in pleasure and in self-indulgence. And so I kind of soothed myself again as I pondered this question, because the main thrust of chapter 5 is the fact that they lived in pleasure and in self-indulgence on the backs of other people by defrauding them. So I kind of put a note beside James chapter 5, and that this has been, by fraud, and at the cost of others. I thought, well, maybe that isn't me. As far as I know, I've never defrauded anybody to live in luxury. So I can live in luxury all that I want to, as long as I don't defraud anybody. Maybe that's what James is getting at. And that's where the little Greek comes in. So as you get over to 1 Timothy chapter 5, is the only other time that this exact term comes up. And in 1 Timothy chapter 5, he's dealing with the widow. The widow who has nobody else, no one to take care of her, no means of her own. And so this is the widow that's going to be enrolled in the church, meaning that from here on out, the church is going to financially support her. That this is a need that is greater than one person is able to bear, so the church is going to do this. But in chapter 5, there's a list of requirements, the character requirements and family requirements. She has to be a widow all on her own. If not, then she needs to have her family take care of them. But as he gets here in chapter 5, he gets into the character requirements. It's not just anybody who wanders off the street, who claims to be a Christian and claims that their husband had died, that just starts living off of the support of the church. He says in verse 3, honor widows who are truly widows. He mentions in verse 4 that if she has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return for their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has her hope set on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. And again, almost exactly the same terminology, whether you're reading King James, New King James, New American Standard, or Holman Christian Standard Bible that you read in James, is going to be the wording here. So either once in pleasure, living in pleasure, lives in pleasure, or self-indulgence is going to be the terminology that comes up in these verses. Well, there is nowhere here in chapter 5 that she's done this at the cost of others or by fraud. That isn't a part of the context. So here is just a statement of here is somebody who lives self-indulgently. And how he phrases it is not, again, no pulling punches. She who is self-indulgent is dead already even though she lives. Well, maybe I can soothe myself in this verse and say, well, I'm not a widow. And I never will be a widow, maybe a widower. But this verse will, again, never apply to me. Maybe I can ignore this verse. But he lays down the principle of a godly person in these verses that happen to apply to this woman, or to these women who find themselves in this circumstance. So I started comparing the beginning of verse 5 to the latter part of verse 6, verse 6, that she has set her hope in God, and she continues in supplication and prayer night and day. Sometimes we have a hard time wrapping our mind around circumstances that some of the early Christians found themselves in. We have so many other support systems and different society now than they had back then, or in most parts of the world. We're dealing with somebody who, once their husband is gone, their sole means of support usually is gone too, with very little ability to get a job or to work hard and provide for themselves. This is someone who truly is down and out, someone who really has nothing else. We're not talking about individuals who have their own jobs and have a nice bank account or has been left with a very large life insurance policy. That's not what he's dealing with. He's dealing with here somebody who has absolutely nothing. And he compares and contrasts the mindset in verse 5. In verse 5, the mindset is, here is somebody who has nothing. She's lost her only family. She has no means of support for herself. And yet her mindset in verse 5 is that she trusts in the Lord, puts her hope in the Lord, and that she continues night and day in supplications and prayers. Now, a supplication is a prayer asking for God to supply. And almost unanimously through the scriptures, a supplication is not primarily for yourself. A supplication is primarily a prayer for somebody else. And supply this person with what they need, or supply this nation for what they need, or supply us with good leaders, or it's a prayer usually aimed for somebody else. And so you get to see the mindset of the woman that we're looking for in verse 5. So as we talked about earlier, that she has her hope set on God, not on riches, that she has her mind that even though she has nothing, her prayers are not consumed with herself, but her prayers tend to look outside of herself. And then he contrasts that in verse 6. The person who is self-indulgent is dead already. So here's the mindset of a woman who just, it's all about me. Even though I have nothing, I still want everything. My mindset is still primarily on me. And he says there in verse 6, she's dead already, even though she lives. And so now we're getting closer to the heart of the matter. So if we're looking at James chapter 5, we understand that the context is at the cost of others, by defrauding other people. And therefore, this indulgent lifestyle is something that he is angry at. But in 1 Timothy chapter 5, that isn't the case. It's a different context. He's dealing with, where is your mindset at when it comes to these worldly things? Whether you have a lot or a little, are you someone who self-indulges, or are you somebody who truly has a heart set on God and a mind for prayer for other people? And now we're getting closer. Now, these are the only two times that this terminology is used in the New Testament. But the concept is still in another passage. And another passage, if you have guessed, is Luke chapter 16. So, just because the same term doesn't show up in another context, it usually means pretty much absolutely nothing. If the concepts are still the same, then we can work from there. In Luke chapter 16 we find just that. We find the exact same principle without the exact same terminology. So Luke chapter 16, starting right around verse 19, is the story of the rich man and Lazarus, sometimes called the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. We won't get into all the differentiating between stories and parables. You can take whatever view you want on it. I'll tell you I think it's a story, and if we want to discuss it later, I'll have lots of reason to beat you down with it. But getting back to Luke chapter 16, he begins in verse 19 that there was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. Now we put ourselves into that scenario. Which one of us has not had nicer clothes from time to time in life? And not just we can choose to have nice clothes, but we have a whole wardrobe of nice clothes. Do we define ourselves as rich? Again, look at the grand scheme of world economics. If we are probably rich enough to get Starbucks on a regular basis, we're probably rich. If we're rich enough to get Starbucks, that makes us grow out of our regular clothes, so we have an entire closet full of clothes that are nice that we don't fit into because of our $5, then we're probably rich. This probably fits us pretty well. this story here in Luke 16 is something we really need to pause and ask ourselves how it applies to us. So here's a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine clothing, and he feasted sumptuously every day. Again, we don't just have our daily food, we have a lot of daily food. And if you watch any news articles or entertainment from around the world, we are known around the world for being people who feast sumptuously every day. We are known as being overweight, fat Americans who just stuff their mouths. That is our world reputation. We are known as being exactly this in verse 19. So whenever we get to this point, we need to really pause and ask, what is the point that we need to learn? And to ask ourselves, what's happened? So here is the man who dresses nicely, he is classified as rich, he feasts every day, and at his gates was a poor man named Lazarus, covered in sores, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores, and the poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried, and in Hades, being in torment. He lifted up his eyes, and he saw Abraham afar off and Lazarus at his side. And he called out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame. But Abraham said, Child, remember that in your lifetime you received good things, and Lazarus in his manner bad things. But now he is in comfort here, and you are in anguish. Besides all of this, between us and you there is a great chasm that has been fixed in order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able to, and no one may cross from there to us. He said, I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they also should come into this place of torment. There's not a ton of context of how this man lived, or how Lazarus lived, apart from this concept of wealth. And there seems to be no indication here in verse 19 that he lived it by fraud or at the cost of others. That isn't a part of what is implied or what is stated. And he's not a widow who is self-indulgent. So 1 Timothy chapter 6, again, isn't the exact context of this passage. So what is it that characterized this person? What characterizes this person is that here is a man who has everything he needs in abundance. And there is somebody else just at his gate who lacks. And so while he's not doing it by the cost of others, he is doing it at the neglect of others. And this one starts to hit home a bit more. And while we may satisfy ourselves with James chapter 5 like I have for years now, and think, well, I've just never defrauded anybody, therefore I'm okay. And I'm not a widow, so I'm probably okay there too. Luke chapter 6, though, is have to wrestle with this one. Because by worldly standards, if you travel anywhere with an American accent, you will be known as being a rich person. We will have the reputation of being people who dress nicely and feast sumptuously every day. And I certainly don't want to end up where this rich man ended up. And the principle, part of that principle here, ends up being that he did it at the neglect of other people. That Lazarus was right at your gate, and he longed just for the scraps off your table, but all he got was dogs licking his wounds. So now comes in the question of what does it mean to live sumptuously, or live wantingly, or living in pleasure or self-indulgence. I'm going to give you 3 other passages we're going to work through real quick, and hopefully kind of come up with some paradigms that we can work with. One is going to be, we'll change colors. 1 John chapter 3. And we're going to look at verses 16 through 18. And in just a few moments, we'll look at Luke chapter 12. Specifically, we're going to deal with verses 13 through 21. and then we'll head over finally into Titus chapter 3 and verse 14. Let's begin over in 1 John chapter 3. I think that there is plenty of information throughout Scripture, as we looked at this morning in Ecclesiastes, that God blesses us. And in blessing us, He does intend for us to enjoy the work that we do and enjoy the fruit of our labor. But Jesus puts a huge exclamation point in Luke chapter 16, says we cannot do that at the neglect of other people. So, who am I responsible? Who is it that I'm supposed to help? So if I consider my lifestyle, I think, well, I'm being self-indulgent. I'm the rich person, fine clothes, who feasts sumptuously every day. That this may be me, and maybe I'm doing it in the neglect of other people. That then all of a sudden our eyes are opened, and the entire world seems like bottomless money pits. That we just never have enough money to give to everybody. Anybody who has need, I don't have the ability to do that. As rich as I am as an American, I just do not have that kind of money. Period. So 1 John chapter 3, I think, gives us some context and helps explain a little bit of Luke chapter 16. Let's begin there in verse 16. 1 John chapter 3, starting there in verse 16. John writes, "By this we know love, that He laid down His life for us, that we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need and yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not love in word or in talk, but in deed and in truth." So the question comes up, am I responsible to find somebody over in Malaysia who's my brother that is lacking of daily food or clothing? Do I have to go and find every single person that is in that circumstance? I don't think the answer is yes. Primarily from the wording here in chapter 3, there in verse 17. If anyone has the world's goods, that's us, let's go ahead and check that box, and then sees his brother in need, that seems even harder. The rich man is not condemned because he did not help somebody that he's never met, never seen, never heard of, and he lived sumptuously. That isn't what he was condemned for. He was condemned for Lazarus being right outside his gates and never helped him. He saw him on a daily basis and yet closed his heart to him. And that seems to be the case for us. What is the need that we see that we then close our heart to? What is it we think, well, they just don't need it, or I need it more, or I can't do all the things I want to do if I help them out? That's what he's talking about here. How can God's love abide in you if you see somebody else in need and then turn a blind eye? And that is going to change from time to time of where you see the need happen. But if that is us, if we are the people who have the world's goods, who feast sumptuously every day, and we see the needs and then close our heart to them, he makes the point the love of God is not abide in us. And we do a really good job of loving in talk and in word, but God commands us to love in truth and in deed. We have to have that rubber hit the road. We have to do something with it. So while we look at James chapter 5, we think, oh, well, I never defrauded anybody to live on their dime in luxury. Maybe we simply are people who live in luxury by the neglect of other people, and that's something we really need to consider. So 1 John chapter 3 kind of narrows our scope and says, well, it's who I see. Now that's not license for us to go around like the proverbial ostrich and just bury our head in the sand and say, well, I never see anybody's need, therefore I have no need to help. That isn't the idea either. But let's look over to Luke chapter 12. Mac had mentioned this, and I apologize to Mac for not jumping on Luke chapter 12 in Bible class. I had an ulterior motive for dealing with it now. Starting there in verse 13 is the parable of the rich fool. Again, even just classifying as the rich fool, they think, that probably applies to me. But there in verse 13, someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." So here's a Here's an opportunity where Jesus, the Christ, Lord, Savior, God incarnate, come to earth and give you life-giving messages. And someone says, let's quibble over inheritance. Let's talk about money. You make this happen. And Jesus replied, he said to the man, who made me a judge or an arbitrator over you? And he said to them, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. And he told them parables, saying, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, what shall I do, for I have nowhere to store all my crops? And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. And God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasures for himself and is not rich towards God. So we have the same principle we see here in Luke chapter 16, similar to the same thing we're talking here. Here's a person who lives in luxury because he has been blessed by God and then stores it up for himself. In my musings and my wrestlings this week, I had ended up having a call with somebody, and he pointed out this passage for me and said, this does a pretty good job of pointing us out because of how we build larger barns. He made the point that about 10 years ago, one of the fastest growing businesses in the United States was mini storage units. They're everywhere. Because we as Americans, we build large houses, we fill them with all of the world's goods, and we run out of room, then we get a storage unit and run out of storage unit. It's not a one-to-one ratio, but it does make us pause and wonder. What happens whenever we have fields that God has blessed us with, that then produce abundantly as God has blessed us with, and then we say to ourselves, I'll store it up for myself for the future. What happens when goods increase? Do we end up storing them for ourselves and using them for ourselves? Or are we people who, as goods increase, our generosity increases? If we're faithful in a little, do we become faithful in much? These are the things that I wrestled with this week. Ask myself, whenever I do live indulgently, am I really doing it at the neglect of other people? Am I someone who tends to be someone who stores up treasures for himself and fails to be rich towards God? So, we're getting close to the end. I start off with self-satisfying over James chapter 5. I think I surely can't be. And while I do live pretty self-indulgently, my waistline every year tells me that self-indulgence grows. It can't be me because I never defrauded anybody. Never lived in the lap of luxury on the backs of somebody else. And while the same word comes up over in Timothy for the widow, well, obviously, that can't be me either because I'm not a widow. The question is even when I feel poor, is my mindset still on God's hope? And do I really, truly pray for other people a lot? But as you get over into Luke chapter 16, I really have to ask myself, whenever I see someone else in need, do I close my heart to them? Do I do it in the neglect of other people? That is a serious question. When I go over to Titus chapter 3, this is going to be maybe one of the harder hitting ones for me at least. Whether or not it'll be as thorny for you or not will be another issue. Titus chapter 3, we're going to look right down towards the end of the chapter. He has made the progression at the end of chapter 2 that we should be people who are zealous for good works. It tells us at the beginning of chapter 3 that we should be ready for good works. And then later on in verse 8, that this is a trustworthy saying, and Paul wants him to insist on these things, that we be devoted to good works. And as Lee pointed out a few weeks ago, he says it again in verse 14. And let our people, us Christians, learn to devote themselves to good works, and to help causes of urgent need, and not to be unfruitful. And here's the rub. happens to my budget? Well, I have X amount of money, and therefore I spend X amount of money while it's due. I press my budget so much that when urgent cases of need come up, I can easily slough it off and say, well, it's not my responsibility because my money is all tied up. But my money is all tied up in being self-indulgent. I have spent myself to the very brink of what I can afford to live as a rich American who clothes in fine clothing and feasts sumptuously every day, and become neglectful of other people because, well, it's just not in my budget to do so. And Paul writes in Titus for them to be people who are ready for good works and devoted to good works and zealous for good works so that they can help in times of urgent need. And so oftentimes, well, it's not in my budget right now. I haven't planned for that. I spent too much at Starbucks and had to buy new clothes because I outgrew the last ones. We have so many things that are peripheral things in life that we have expended ourselves on so that we cannot spend ourselves on other people. And so that passage in James chapter 5 where I thought I was going to be able to study my way out of it, and I thought for sure that I was going to be fine and happy by the end of the day, that passage doesn't apply to me, oh man, it applies to me. And it's a struggle. Because our society, our culture, teaches us that you spend your budget to the max to live as best as you can here. And maybe budget a little bit to help, but not a whole lot to help. And when cases of urgent need, that which is above and beyond, then don't worry about that. It isn't your problem to deal with. But it is my problem to deal with as a disciple of Christ. I am to be zealous for that work. I am to be ready for that work. And I'm to be devoted to that work. Because if I see the need and then I close my heart, the love of Christ does not dwell in me. And so when James deals with those back in chapter 5 who live lavishly on this earth and in self-indulgent lifestyle, whether it's at the cost of other people or it's at the neglect of other people, those are passages that we really need to self-examine. That we need to pause and ask ourselves, how am I doing this? That God has granted us talents of wealth in order for us not to self-indulge, but to spread His grace. So the question for us this week is, how have we done with that? And the answer for me is not well. It's just not. Because my culture has taught me to be one way, and I've neglected what the Bible has taught me to do properly. And so I hope and I plan to reevaluate some of the ways that I live life in order to be someone who is open to see the needs of other people, who is then zealous to help, and then ready to do so. There may be times where I don't have the abilities as I want to, but I hope my zeal always outpaces that. The invitation song, for whoever has picked that out, is number 829. If you notice in the passages that we've looked at, James chapter 5 deals with preparing to meet your God. That the cries of the laborers have reached out to the ears of the Lord of hosts. If you look at Luke chapter 16, he's dealing with the story of the rich man and Lazarus who had to present himself before God for that purpose. Same thing with Luke chapter 12. Full of your soul is required of you this night. In a couple seconds, we're going to sing a song, Prepare to Meet with God. Money is one of those things we have to wrestle with. We have to come up with a reasonable way to live justly before God. But our sin has caused separation. And if your sins still remain, then there is no better time to take care of it than that. That is a part of your preparation to God. And if we can help you to do that this morning or this afternoon, let us know as we stand and sing number 829.